Millionaire buys an abandoned mansion and stumbles upon a mystery that changes everything. Madrid, with its grand streets and historic facades, served as the perfect backdrop for Alexander to grow his business empire. Known as a visionary, he had a knack for turning any investment into gold. From a young age, Alexander poured himself into his work, and that relentless drive helped him build a financial empire many envied. But despite all his success, there was a void he couldn't quite explain. One morning, while sipping coffee in his luxurious office, he received a call from a real estate agent. "Alexander, I've got something you might find interesting," the agent began, his voice brimming with enthusiasm. "It's a historic mansion on the outskirts of Madrid. It's been abandoned for decades, but the structure is stunning. With the right renovations, its value could skyrocket." Intrigued, Alexander asked for more details and was instantly captivated by the photos. The mansion was a 19th century masterpiece, boasting grand columns, intricate details, and a garden that, though overgrown, still carried an air of faded elegance. It was exactly the kind of project Alexander loved. "Schedule a visit," he said with a slight smile. "I want to see it in person." 2 days later, Alexander drove out to the property, nestled in a quiet, secluded area. As his car made its way down a tree-lined road, he felt a mix of curiosity and excitement. When the mansion finally came into view, partially obscured by wild vegetation, he paused to take in the scene. "It's even more striking in person," he murmured as he stepped out of the car. The facade was weathered, with broken windows and peeling paint, yet its grandeur still shone through. Alexander didn't see a crumbling house, he saw potential. Walking through the overrun garden, he imagined restoring it to its former glory. As he stepped inside, he was greeted by the creak of old wood and the smell of dust. The high ceilings, adorned with chandeliers now draped in cobwebs, and the cracked marble floors lent the space an air of melancholy. But to Alexander, it was a challenge, and he thrived on challenges. "This house has a soul," he said, his excitement evident as the agent trailed behind him. "With the right work, it could become a true gem again." The agent smiled, pleased by Alexander's enthusiasm. "You're right. You know, there are plenty of rumors about this place," he added. "They say it hosted grand parties in the past, but also saw its share of tragedies." Alexander raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Tragedies?" The agent shrugged casually. "Old stories, nothing verified. Just local legends." Alexander wasn't the kind of man to be swayed by superstitions. For him, numbers were all that mattered, and in this case, the numbers added up. He decided to finalize the deal that very day. Back in his office, he started planning the renovation. He hired a team of architects and engineers to evaluate the structure and draft a timeline. To him, turning that mansion into a high-end property was just another milestone in his career. Yet, even as he pored over reports and discussed design possibilities, something about the mansion lingered in his mind. It was as if the place had an energy of its own, something he couldn't quite put into words. "It's just a house," he told himself, brushing off the odd feeling. Deep down, though, he sensed there was more to it. Little did Alexander know, the real treasure of the mansion wasn't in its walls or its old-world charm but in something he could never have imagined. Something that was about to change his life forever. When Alexander returned to the mansion to begin the detailed inspections, he was full of anticipation. The team of architects and engineers had already arrived, moving through the rooms and snapping photos for their report. But Alexander lingered outside. While the engineers assessed the foundations, Alexander wandered through the overgrown garden, lost in thoughts of how to transform the space into something extraordinary. But stepping inside, the atmosphere shifted. The silence was so profound that even the sound of his footsteps echoed through the empty hallways. "Time seems to have stopped here," one of the engineers remarked, glancing up at the ceiling, where a faded painting depicted angels among clouds. Alexander nodded but said nothing. His attention was drawn to something he had noticed on his last visit. Now, it seemed even more striking. Several windows on the second floor were latched from the inside. "Strange," he muttered. "Did you say something, sir?" one of the workers asked. "Number nothing," Alexander replied, though his mind raced with questions. If the house had been abandoned for years, who had locked those windows? As the team worked downstairs, Alexander ventured alone to explore the upper floor. He opened door after door, finding furniture draped in dusty sheets and empty wardrobes. But as he entered a room at the end of the hall, something caught his attention. The air in the room felt different, heavier. It was a small space with an iron bed pushed against one wall and a window partly ajar. On the floor lay an old, neatly folded blanket, a small flashlight, and some discarded food wrappers. Alexander crouched to inspect the items, his heartbeat quickening. Who was here? He wondered. Suddenly, a faint noise made him freeze. It was a soft, almost imperceptible sound, like something or someone moving upstairs. Alexander rose slowly and followed the sound, his stomach twisting with unease. He climbed the staircase leading to the attic, each step creaking under his weight. At the top, he found a door slightly ajar. Pushing it gently, he stepped into the dim, dusty space. Before he could investigate, hurried footsteps echoed behind him. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice reverberating. There was no reply, just the sound of footsteps rushing back down the hallway. Alexander descended quickly, but when he reached the ground floor, silence had returned. He looked around, searching for something, or someone, that could explain what had just happened. The next day, Alexander returned to the mansion with his friend Mike, a restorer experienced in handling old properties. He recounted the strange sounds and what he had seen, but Mike merely chuckled, dismissing it as Alexander's imagination. "Old houses like this always have weird noises," Mike said, examining the intricate carvings on a wooden staircase. "Probably just the wind or some animal." Alexander wasn't convinced but decided to drop the subject for the time being. He continued exploring the upper floors, paying closer attention this time. Passing through the same room where he'd found the blanket, he noticed something new, a piece of paper caught beneath a piece of furniture. Picking it up, he found it crumpled and dusty but still legible. It was a child's drawing, made with colored pencils. It depicted a little girl holding a baby, with what appeared to be the mansion in the background. Alexander furrowed his brow. "This can't be," he muttered to himself. That night, sleep eluded him as his mind raced with thoughts of the drawing, the blanket, and the sounds he'd heard. One thing was clear, the house wasn't as abandoned as he had thought. The following day, Alexander decided to investigate on his own. He returned to the mansion in the late afternoon, after the renovation crew had left. With a flashlight in hand, he wandered the hallways in silence, examining every detail. When he reached the attic again, the air felt as heavy as it had the previous day. Then he saw something that made him freeze. In a shadowy corner of the attic, partially obscured, was a small figure. A girl, no older than 10, stared at him with wide, frightened eyes. "Hello," Alexander said, lowering his flashlight to avoid scaring her. "It's okay. I'm not going to hurt you." The girl didn't respond but stepped back slightly, clutching something that looked like a blanket. Alexander took a cautious step forward, moving slowly. "My name is Alexander," he said, trying to sound calm. "What are you doing here?" The girl stared at him for a moment before whispering in a barely audible voice. "I live here. Please, don't send us away," Grace pleaded, her voice trembling. Alexander froze, trying to comprehend what he had just heard. "Us?" he asked, his tone laced with confusion. The girl nodded and pointed behind her. That's when Alexander noticed a baby wrapped in a blanket, peacefully asleep in a makeshift corner of the dusty attic. In that moment, it became clear. This mansion held more than just echoes of the past. He wasn't just dealing with an abandoned property. He was stepping into a mystery that would alter his life forever. Alexander stood still, his eyes shifting between the girl and the baby in the shadowy attic. His flashlight quivered slightly in his grasp, but he steadied himself. There was no doubt now, the children were living there. Alone. In the darkness of this forgotten house. The girl watched him warily, her small figure partially shielded by the blanket she clutched as if it were her armor. The baby remained nestled in the corner, undisturbed by the tense atmosphere. Alexander drew a deep breath and broke the silence. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "Grace," the girl whispered, barely audible. Alexander offered a tentative smile, crouching to meet her gaze. "Grace, you don't need to be afraid. I'm here to help." Her lips pressed together as she took a hesitant step back. "Nobody can help us. They all say that, but then they leave. It's always just me, looking after him." "I'm not going anywhere," Alexander said firmly, hoping to reassure her. "But I need to understand what's going on." "Are you here alone?" Grace hesitated, glancing at the baby before nodding. "Yes. Just me and Ethan." As Alexander processed the weight of her words, a sudden noise echoed from the corridor below. The metallic clatter sounded sharp, like something had fallen. Grace's eyes widened, and Alexander felt his pulse quicken. Does that happen often?" he asked. Grace nodded slowly. "Sometimes. Always when someone new comes into the house." Alexander wasn't sure what to make of it. Maybe it was just the quirks of the old mansion, its decaying structure playing tricks. Or maybe, just maybe, there was someone or something else here with them. Gripping the flashlight more tightly, he turned to Grace. "Stay here. I'll check it out." "No," Grace exclaimed, grabbing his arm. "Don't go. What if it's someone bad?" The fear in her voice gave Alexander pause. He glanced down the dark hallway and, for a moment, doubted his own decision. But the thought of leaving Grace and Ethan unprotected seemed far worse. "I promise I'll be quick," he assured her, trying to sound confident. Grace reluctantly released his arm, and Alexander descended the stairs, his flashlight casting a faint glow on each creaking step. The sound had come from the first floor, near the main entrance. Moving cautiously, Alexander felt the chill of the night seeping through the broken windows. Reaching the ground floor, he spotted an old metal chair toppled over on the floor. At first glance, it seemed as though it had simply fallen on its own. Maybe it's just the wind, he thought, bending down to get a closer look at the marks. A soft noise echoed behind him, like the faint creak of wooden planks. Alexander spun around quickly, but all he saw were shadows. He started to nod, a cold shiver running down his spine. It was clear that something, or someone, was moving through the house. "If it's someone, you'd better come out, damn it," he shouted, his voice firm. He thought of the strange vibes the place gave him. Grace didn't seem convinced, but she didn't argue. Her silence hung heavy, though she kept glancing away, avoiding his eyes. Alexander tried to make sense of it all. What was going on here? He didn't have answers, but he could feel the tension in his chest. Grace dropped her gaze, evading his as if she carried some unspoken burden. "My mom told me she'd come back, but she didn't." Alexander felt a lump in his throat. It was obvious Grace was struggling to protect her little brother while clinging to a fragile hope. But reality was harsh. He needed to act quickly, but without alarming her. Grace looked at him, her expression wary but determined. Alexander quickly placed Grace and Ethan into his car, feeling the weight of responsibility pressing harder on him. He knew he had to uncover what was truly happening in that ominous house and why two kids were left to survive there alone. As he drove back to the city, his mind raced. The mysteries of the mansion lingered, gnawing at him like an unfinished puzzle. In the silence of the car, Ethan's soft breathing and Grace's quiet murmurs filled the air. She still held her brother tightly, her thin arms wrapping around the baby's small body as if she were his only shield. Alexander glanced at Grace through the rearview mirror, struggling to find the right words. "Are you hungry?" he finally asked, breaking the silence. She hesitated, then nodded. "Ethan needs to eat," she said softly, her voice trembling with concern. "Don't worry, we'll take care of that now," Alexander reassured her, steering toward a restaurant he knew. He told Grace and Ethan to stay in the car while he went inside to grab some food. He understood that the little girl still didn't fully trust him and didn't want to push her into dealing with a crowd of strangers. When he returned with a bag of food, Grace was sitting stiffly, her body tense as if bracing for something bad to happen. "Eat up," Alexander said gently, handing her the bag. "There's milk for Ethan too." Grace carefully opened the bag, handling it as if she were afraid of damaging something inside. She pulled out a small sandwich and began eating it slowly, her eyes cautiously studying Alexander. She seemed to analyze every move he made, trying to determine if he could be trusted. Ethan began shifting in Grace's lap, letting out a faint whimper. She quickly grabbed the bottle of milk Alexander had brought and started feeding him. The baby clutched the bottle with his tiny hands, drinking with such urgency that it tugged at Alexander's heart. "You take good care of him," he remarked softly, offering a gentle smile. "He's my brother," Grace replied, as though that explained everything. Once Grace and Ethan had finished eating, Alexander decided it was time to ask more direct questions. He needed to understand what had happened and why these children were alone in that mansion. "Grace," he began carefully, "you said your mother promised to come back. What happened exactly?" Grace lowered her eyes, her fingers nervously fidgeting with the edge of Ethan's blanket. "She brought us there because she didn't have anywhere else to go," she finally said. "She said the house belonged to someone she knew, and we'd be safe there. But then she left to get food and didn't come back." Alexander felt a lump form in his throat. "How long ago was that?" "I don't know," Grace said, shaking her head. "Maybe weeks." Her response made his concern deepen. He knew he had to act quickly. "Grace, I want to help you, but I need to know more about your mother. Do you know where she might be? Anyone she knows, or places she might visit often?" Grace shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "She didn't talk much about that," she whispered. She only said she was trying to find work, but she always looked so sad. Alexander realized there were no simple answers here. He had no idea where to start looking for the children's mother, but one thing was clear: Grace and Ethan needed a safe place to stay until he could figure out what to do. "You'll stay with me?" he said firmly. Grace's eyes widened in surprise. "Stay with you? Why?" "Because you need a safe place," he replied with conviction. "And I promise I won't leave you alone." She looked at him for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether to believe his words. Finally, she gave a hesitant nod. When they arrived at Alexander's apartment, Grace looked visibly uneasy. The space was large and modern, filled with sleek furniture and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered breathtaking views of the city. To her, it was a world completely removed from the cold, damp basement where she and Ethan had spent the last few weeks. "Make yourselves at home," Alexander said, guiding her toward the sofa. "I'll prepare a room for you." Grace sat down cautiously, still holding Ethan tightly, as though bracing for something unexpected to happen at any moment. Alexander felt a pang in his chest at how guarded she was. He knew earning her trust would be a slow process. Later, when he returned with a clean blanket and some new clothes he had stored away, he found Grace asleep on the sofa, Ethan curled up in her arms. Alexander paused for a moment, taking in the scene before him. He had never felt such a sense of responsibility for someone else before. Although he was a man used to making critical decisions and leading entire teams, nothing in his past had prepared him for this. Yet, as he looked at Grace and Ethan asleep on his couch, he knew he had made the right choice. Watching the two children resting peacefully, a new determination took hold of him. Alexander understood that protecting Grace and Ethan was just the beginning of a journey, one that would uncover mysteries about their mother and that eerie mansion far beyond anything he could have imagined. What he didn't know yet was that his decision to help these kids would lead him to a secret that would alter his life forever. When the morning sunlight spilled into the apartment, Alexander woke up early, resolved to show Grace and Ethan that they could trust him. He had spent much of the night discreetly researching shelters and social services, yet one thought lingered. Handing them off to someone else didn't feel like the right solution. As he prepared breakfast, the sound of small footsteps caught his attention. Grace stood in the hallway, holding Ethan in her arms. Her eyes were red, as if she had cried all night, but there was still a defiant air about her. "Good morning," Alexander said softly. Grace gave a small nod but remained silent. "I've made something for you," he continued, gesturing to the table. "Come sit here." Grace hesitated but eventually approached. She placed Ethan in a makeshift chair Alexander had set up and sat down, her gaze fixed warily on his every move. Alexander served a plate of toast, fruit, and a glass of juice for Grace, along with a bottle of milk for Ethan. "I wasn't sure what you like, so I kept it simple," he said with a gentle smile. Grace eyed the plate cautiously, as if struggling to believe it was really for her. After a few seconds, she began to eat, slowly and in silence. Alexander seized the moment to try starting a conversation. He knew gaining Grace's trust was crucial to helping them. As they sat there, he couldn't shake the weight of their situation. He had no blueprint for this, no manual to follow. But something about the determination in Grace's posture and the vulnerability in Ethan's tiny hands sparked a resolve in him to do whatever it took. Alexander began sketching out a routine for their days ahead, organizing a life for the three of them that felt more like a family than a stopgap. Compelling toys for Grace and Ethan, even a small table where Grace could draw or write, sat in the sunlight-drenched room as Alexander worked on sorting papers. Lost in thought at the desk, he let out a sigh, his mind preoccupied with the children's well-being. "Kids deserve stability," he murmured. That single thought ignited a flicker of determination in him. Alexander decided to give the children a taste of normalcy and took them to a nearby park. Grace seemed hesitant at first, her body language guarded, but gradually she relaxed as she watched other kids play. Ethan babbled happily in Alexander's arms while Grace observed the children on the swings with a distant expression. "Did you used to play in parks?" Alexander asked gently. "Yes, before." Grace began but trailed off, struggling to finish the thought. "Before your mom brought you to the mansion?" he prompted softly. She nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "She always said things would get better, but they didn't. I just wish she was here now." "I know, Grace. I promise I'll do everything I can to help you and Ethan," Alexander said firmly. For the first time, Grace's eyes held something beyond distrust, a flicker of hope. Alexander realized he was beginning to earn her trust, but he also knew this was only the start. To truly help them, he needed to understand what had happened to their mother and uncover the secrets of the mansion. Back at the apartment, Alexander couldn't shake thoughts of Grace's story and the eerie mansion where he'd found her. What could drive a mother to abandon her children in such a grim and dangerous place? And why did that house feel so shrouded in mystery? That evening, after tucking Ethan into bed and watching Grace curl up on the couch with a book, Alexander resolved to seek answers. He opened his laptop and began researching the mansion. The initial findings were mundane. A historic property built by an aristocratic family in the late 19th century, later sold multiple times and eventually abandoned after a partial fire. But on a local history site, he stumbled upon something more intriguing. Rumors suggested the mansion was steeped in family disputes and unresolved secrets. Some neighbors claimed it brought misfortune, while others spoke of strange lights and voices lingering long after it was abandoned. Superstitions, Alexander muttered to himself, but deep down, he knew there was more to uncover. Alexander knew deep down it wasn't just that. Grace and Ethan were living proof that something deeper was happening in that house, something waiting to be uncovered. The next morning, as Grace sipped her coffee and Ethan played on the carpet, Alexander decided to give it another try. He could feel Grace starting to trust him, but there was still so much she was keeping from him. Grace glanced at her plate, avoiding his gaze. She said it was the only safe place. That no one would ever find them there. Did she explain why she thought that? Was there a connection to the house? Grace hesitated before answering. She admitted she knew the house, that she'd been there before. Grace already knew the house, which made Alexander wonder if there was more to the story than he'd imagined. And you? Have you been there before? He asked. Grace shook her head. No, it was my first time. But somehow, it felt familiar. That's why I decided to return. Alexander knew it wasn't safe to bring Grace and Ethan back. So he turned to a trusted friend, Emily, to watch over them while he made another trip. Are you sure you want to go back there alone? Emily asked, concerned. I have to, Alexander replied. There's something in that house, something directly tied to these children. I need to understand what it is. When he reached the mansion, it looked even more abandoned than before. The wind blew through shattered windows, sending the tattered curtains flapping like silent ghosts. Flashlight in hand, Alexander stepped inside to explore the rooms once more. This time, he noticed things he'd missed before. Small scratches on the walls, objects that seemed recently moved. In one room, he discovered a worn, old notebook tucked under a pile of aged clothing. Carefully, Alexander opened it, realizing it was a diary. As he read the first pages, a chill ran down his spine. The words were disjointed, but there was something hauntingly personal about them, as though the writer had been desperate to capture their thoughts before it was too late. One sketch stood out. A woman holding two children, with the mansion looming in the background. Beneath the drawing, a cryptic note read, "Everything is connected." Alexander shut the notebook, his heart racing. He didn't know exactly what it meant, but it was clear the mansion held far more secrets than he'd anticipated. Back at the apartment, Alexander found Grace playing with Ethan. He hesitated to tell her what he'd found, afraid to scare her, but he knew he had to be honest. Sitting beside her, he said, "I found something in the mansion. A notebook. I think it might have belonged to your mother or someone who was there before." Grace's eyes widened. "What did it say?" "I'm still piecing it together," Alexander replied. "But it mentioned fear, secrets, and there was a drawing, one that looked a lot like yours." Grace sat quietly for a moment before speaking. "My mother used to say the mansion was important. That there was something there that could save us." Alexander felt the weight of her words. If the mansion had been so significant to Grace's mother, maybe the answers to everything lay hidden there. Yet the more Alexander delved into the mystery, the more he realized the mansion wasn't just a place filled with old stories. It was the heart of a puzzle that intertwined his past with Grace and Ethan's future. Here's the rewritten version based on your rules. Deep down, he understood it wasn't just that. Grace and Ethan were proof that something strange was happening in that house, something yet to be uncovered. The next morning, while Grace sipped her coffee and Ethan played on the rug, Alexander decided to try again. He could tell Grace was beginning to trust him, but there was still so much she wasn't revealing. Grace looked down at her plate, avoiding his gaze. She said it was the only safe place. That no one would find them there. Did she mention why she thought that? Was there some connection to the house? Grace hesitated before replying. She said she knew the house, that she'd been there before. But Grace already being familiar with the house suggested there was more to the story than he'd realized. And you? Had you been there before? Grace shook her head. No, it was my first time. But it felt familiar in a strange way. Like it was calling me back. Alexander knew it wouldn't be safe to bring Grace and Ethan along. So he asked a trusted friend, Emily, to watch over them while he went back to the house. "Are you sure you want to go back there alone?" Emily asked, concerned. "I have to," Alexander replied. "There's something in that house that ties directly to these kids. I need to figure out what it is." When he reached the mansion, the place looked even more desolate than before. The wind howled through the broken windows, making the tattered curtains ripple like silent ghosts. Flashlight in hand, Alexander stepped inside and began to search the rooms again. This time, he noticed things he'd missed before. Small scratches on the walls, objects that seemed recently disturbed. In one of the rooms, he found an old, tattered notebook hidden under a pile of aged clothes. Carefully, Alexander opened it and realized it was a diary. The first few pages gave him chills. The words didn't make much sense, but there was something hauntingly personal about them. It felt as if the writer had been desperate to record their thoughts before it was too late. One page contained a drawing, a woman holding 2 children, with the mansion in the background. Beneath the sketch, the words "everything is connected" were written. Alexander shut the diary, his heart racing. He didn't know exactly what it meant, but it was clear the mansion held more secrets than he'd imagined. Back at the apartment, Alexander found Grace playing with Ethan. He hesitated to tell her what he'd found, worried it might scare her, but he knew he had to be honest. "Grace," he said, sitting beside her. "I found something in the mansion, a notebook. I think it might have belonged to your mother, or someone who was there before." Grace's eyes widened. "What did it say?" "I'm still trying to figure it out," he replied. "But it mentioned fear, secrets, and there was a drawing. It looked like one of yours." Grace fell silent for a moment before responding. "My mother used to say the mansion was important, that something there could save us." Alexander felt the weight of her words. If the mansion had been so significant to Grace's mother, then maybe the key to everything lay within its walls. But the deeper Alexander delved, the more he realized that the mansion wasn't just a place filled with old stories. It was the center of a mystery, tying his past to Grace and Ethan's future. And it could change their lives forever. Alexander knew he had reached a pivotal moment. The fragments he had uncovered, the diary, Grace's sketches, and her words, pointed to a deeper mystery involving the mansion and the children's mother. But Alexander also understood Grace and Ethan couldn't wait endlessly. A decision needed to be made. He had to ensure their safety while seeking answers. That evening, as Grace tucked Ethan into bed, Alexander sat in the living room, staring at the diary he'd brought from the mansion. He had read it several times, but it always felt like something was slipping through his grasp. What exactly did "everything is connected" mean? Grace's voice broke through his thoughts. "What are you going to do with us?" she asked, standing in the doorway with her arms crossed. Alexander looked up at her, realizing the weight of her question. She wasn't just asking about the present. She wanted to know if there was a secure future for herself and her brother. "I've decided you'll both stay with me," he said with determination. Grace looked startled by his response. "Stay with you? But what if my mother comes back?" "If your mother returns, I promise we'll find her. But until then, I want to make sure you're safe," Alexander assured her. Grace studied him for a moment, trying to determine if she could trust his words. Finally, she nodded. "All right. But what about Ethan? Will he be okay?" "I'll do everything I can to take care of both of you," Alexander replied earnestly. In the following days, Alexander began adjusting his life to accommodate Grace and Ethan. He hired an experienced nanny to help with the baby while he worked and prepared a special room for Grace. He decorated it with soft colors and simple yet cozy furniture that seemed to suit her style. When Grace saw the room for the first time, she stood frozen at the doorway, unsure of what to say. "Is this for me?" she finally asked. "Yes," Alexander said. "This is your space now. I hope you like it." Grace gave a small smile that quickly faded. "I've never had a room of my own before," she murmured, almost as if she were apologizing. Alexander knelt beside her. "Now you have one. And you'll always have it as long as I'm here." While Alexander focused on creating a secure environment for the children, Grace started to open up more. She began to share small glimpses of her past, moments of joy with her mother, the struggles they faced together, and the dreams she used to hold before everything fell apart. "My mom always said that one day we'd have a real home," Grace mentioned one evening as Alexander helped Ethan eat. "Now you do," he replied with a smile. But despite the progress, Alexander knew there was still much to uncover. Grace's mother was still missing, and the mystery surrounding the mansion continued to weigh on him. He understood he couldn't offer Grace and Ethan true peace until all the pieces of the puzzle were brought to light. One afternoon, as Alexander was beginning to believe progress was being made, Grace received a letter. It had been left at the apartment door. A letter? From who? He asked, feeling his pulse quicken. I don't know. It's handwritten and looks old, Grace replied, her voice tinged with uncertainty. But I think I recognize the handwriting. I think it's my mom's. Alexander felt a rush of conflicting emotions. On one hand, the letter might finally provide a clue to Grace's mother's whereabouts. On the other, he feared what the letter might contain. I'm coming home now, he said, ending the call. When he arrived at the apartment, he found Grace clutching the letter, her hands trembling. Ethan was asleep in his crib, and Emily was nearby, trying to comfort her. Let me see, Alexander said, reaching out. Grace hesitated for a moment before handing him the letter. Alexander carefully opened the envelope and began to read. Dear Grace, I'm so sorry for leaving you and Ethan. It was the hardest decision I've ever made, but I had no other choice. I promise everything I did was to protect you both. The mansion holds answers you don't yet understand, but Alexander can help. Trust him. He knows more about this house than you realize. With love, Mom. Alexander froze, rereading the words again. Grace's mother knew who he was, and what he knows more than you realize, truly meant. Grace stared at him, her eyes brimming with questions. What does this mean? I don't know, Alexander replied, still trying to process the letter's contents. But I'm going to find out. Holding the letter tightly, Alexander realized he was far more entangled in this mystery than he ever anticipated. Grace's mother, the mansion, and now himself. It all seemed interconnected. What Alexander didn't yet understand was that the next piece of the puzzle was about to reveal itself, bringing a truth he wasn't ready to face. He spent the night poring over the letter left at the door. Each word echoed in his mind. How did Grace's mother know so much about him? Why did she trust him to help, even though they had never met? The questions multiplied, but the answers stayed maddeningly out of reach. The next day, Alexander decided to act. He returned to the mansion, carrying the diary he had found, the letter, and an unyielding resolve to uncover the truth. This wasn't just a property to explore anymore, it was something personal, woven into his life. Inside the mansion, Alexander began searching every room, paying attention to details he had missed before. In the attic, where he'd found Grace and Ethan, he noticed a hidden staircase behind a false wall. Pushing it with all his strength, he managed to open the entryway, revealing a secret room. The room was cramped and suffocating, filled with old boxes and dust-covered furniture. But what drew his attention most was a stack of documents on a table. Alexander grabbed the papers, realizing they included property records, personal letters, and vintage photographs. As he sifted through the papers, he found something that took his breath away. A photograph of his own family, a portrait of his grandparents taken in the 1940s, standing in front of the very same mansion. This isn't possible, Alexander muttered, his heart pounding. He rummaged through the papers with growing urgency and found a letter signed by his grandfather, mentioning a partnership with the mansion's former owner. It appeared the house had been used as a storage site for valuable goods during the Spanish Civil War. But what began as a relationship built on trust had spiraled into a bitter feud between the two families. That explains why my family never talked about this house, Alexander thought. Back at the apartment, Alexander shared what he had uncovered with Grace. He showed her the photograph and explained his family's connection to the mansion. Grace asked cautiously, "So, you already knew about the house?" Alexander hesitated. "Not exactly," he replied. "My family never talked about it, but it seems the mansion has a tangled past. And somehow, you and Ethan are caught up in it." Grace held Ethan close, staying quiet for a moment before asking, "Do you think that's why my mom brought us there? Because of your family?" Alexander didn't have an answer but knew he had to dig deeper. The following week, Alexander hired a historian who specialized in old estates to decipher the documents he had found. The historian, a man named James, spent hours poring over the papers. Eventually, he uncovered something Alexander had overlooked. A reference to a hidden chest within the mansion. It supposedly contained financial records and letters that could shed light on past events. And maybe even explain how Grace's mother knew so much about it, James added. Alexander felt a mix of excitement and dread. He knew he had to return to the mansion to find the chest, but he also feared what he might uncover. 2 nights later, Alexander returned to the mansion, equipped with tools to open the chest. Following the directions in the document, he discovered it hidden behind the fireplace in the main hall. After considerable effort, he managed to open it. Inside were financial records tied to the original construction of the house, detailing an association the previous owner had formed. But the most disturbing find was a diary written by that owner. It described events leading to accusations of betrayal and collapse, and hinted that Grace's mother had uncovered something dangerous. Letters suggested she knew too much about financial disputes and concealed assets in the mansion and had been forced to flee. Alexander felt a chill run down his spine. Grace's mother hadn't taken her children to the mansion by chance. She believed it held something that could protect them. Back at the apartment, Alexander told Grace everything. He explained the connection between his family and the mansion, the chest, and what he had learned about her mother. Grace listened intently before quietly saying, "She did it to protect us. She knew the mansion was a place where no one would find us." She paused, then asked hesitantly, "Do you think she's still alive?" Alexander met her gaze, seeing the mix of hope and fear in her eyes. "I don't know, but we'll keep looking. At least now we have a starting point." With the newfound information, Alexander knew they were getting closer to the truth. But he also realized that finding Grace's mother meant uncovering not just his family's past but secrets he'd never imagined. In the days that followed, Alexander felt the weight of these revelations. There was something deeply personal tying him to Grace and Ethan. The link between his family and the mansion was unsettling, but the involvement of Grace's mother made the mystery even more complex. One afternoon, as Grace sketched on the couch and Ethan played with his toys, Alexander resolved to confront what was unfolding. The answers they sought were no longer just about the past. They were about the future they hoped to build together. Grace began by sitting beside him. "Do you remember anything your mother might have said about my family? Any story, maybe a name?" She stopped drawing, gripping the pencil tightly. "My mom never mentioned you, but she did talk about the mansion, like it was special. She said there was something there that would protect us." "And do you know what it was?" Grace shook her head. "She only said she was scared. Before taking us there, she cried a lot. I think she was trying to figure out what to do." Alexander placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "I promise you, we're going to uncover the truth. And in the meantime, I'll be here for you both." That evening, while Alexander was putting Ethan to bed, Grace appeared at the doorway. She was holding a piece of paper, another drawing. But this time, it was different from the others. It was a scene of the mansion with three figures, a woman, a girl, and a man. "Did you draw this?" Alexander asked, intrigued. Grace nodded. "I dreamed about it. I think it's my mom, me, and you." Alexander remained silent, studying the drawing. He didn't know how to interpret it, but a shiver ran down his spine. Somehow, it felt like he had been a part of Grace and Ethan's story long before meeting them. The next day, Alexander decided to return to the documents he had discovered in the chest. He knew he had to examine every detail to find a connection to Grace's mother's story. As he read, he came across a letter written by his grandfather, referencing a woman named Catherine. The same name as Grace's mother. In the letter, his grandfather mentioned that Catherine was the one who could protect them. This isn't a coincidence, Alexander thought. My family and theirs have been connected for generations. Back at the apartment, Alexander shared his findings with Grace. He explained his grandfather's letter and how Catherine seemed to know the mansion's secrets. "So my mom knew about your family?" Grace asked, her eyes wide. "It seems she did," Alexander replied. "And she trusted the mansion as a safe place. But we still don't know why." Grace was quiet for a moment before saying, "She trusted you, Alexander. My mom would have trusted you too." Those words struck something deep within him. He realized he wasn't just helping these kids. He was mending a story of pain that had spanned generations. For the first time, he understood that the bond he felt with them went far beyond obligation. Alexander began to wonder if fate had brought Grace and Ethan into his life for a bigger purpose. "They're not just children I'm helping," he thought. "They're my family now." What he didn't realize yet was that his search for answers was about to lead him to a direct confrontation with his own family's past and an earth-shattering truth that would change his life forever. He became increasingly convinced that Grace and Ethan's story was intertwined with his in ways he couldn't yet fully grasp. But one thing was clear. He no longer saw them as a burden or a temporary responsibility. They were part of his life now, and he would do whatever it took to protect them. Over the following months, Alexander's routine shifted dramatically. He spent less time at work, and his focus turned to building a life with the children. He enrolled Grace in a nearby school, where she quickly stood out as a curious and creative student. Her talent for drawing caught everyone's attention, and Alexander nurtured her passion, buying art supplies and even setting up a space where she could paint and sketch. Ethan, on the other hand, was growing quickly, healthy and full of energy. Alexander immersed himself in learning how to care for the baby, from changing diapers to soothing him on the toughest nights. It was exhausting but deeply rewarding. "You're good at this?" Grace said one evening as she watched Alexander rock Ethan to sleep. "I'm learning," he replied with a smile. Grace returned a faint smile, but her eyes carried a mix of gratitude and sadness. One night, as Alexander helped Grace pack her school bag, she sat quietly on the bed before finally speaking. "I remember something," she said suddenly. Alexander looked up, surprised. "About what?" "About my mom," Grace replied. "Before she took us to the mansion, I overheard her on the phone. She said she was going to leave something important there, something that had to stay hidden." Alexander felt his heart tighten. "Do you know what it was?" Grace shook her head. "No, but she said it was to protect me and Ethan." This revelation sparked a new wave of questions. Alexander knew he needed to return to the mansion to uncover what Anna had left behind. The next morning, Alexander drove back to the mansion, this time with Grace by his side. He had a feeling they might find something significant, and he wanted her there to help identify anything important. As they arrived, Grace appeared nervous but determined. She gripped Alexander's hand tightly as they walked through the dim hallways. "It's here," she said, stopping in front of a door Alexander had not yet explored. Inside the room was only an old dresser and some cardboard boxes. Alexander began sifting through the boxes while Grace stood by, watching intently. After a few minutes, she found a small trunk locked tight. "This is it?" Grace whispered, her voice barely audible. Alexander used a tool to pry open the trunk. Inside, there was a collection of documents, including records, letters, and a photo of Catherine holding Grace and Ethan. But what caught Alexander's eye the most was a letter addressed to him. It was from Catherine. In the letter, she explained that she had uncovered something about the old conflict between Alexander's family and the original owner of the mansion. According to Catherine, Alexander's family had stored valuable items in the house, but those possessions had been seized under questionable circumstances. Catherine believed that something in the mansion's records might prove the injustice and provide a way to secure a future for Grace and Ethan. At the end of the letter, Catherine made an even more shocking confession. Alexander and Grace shared a family bond. Alexander's grandfather had secretly been involved with Catherine's grandmother. It was something she had only just discovered. "I am part of your family," the letter concluded. Grace furrowed her brow, confused. "What do you mean?" Alexander carefully explained everything, choosing simple words to help her understand. When he finished, Grace remained silent before saying, "You are my family, Alexander. You always will be." Over the following months, Alexander dedicated his life to ensuring Grace and Ethan had a bright future. He finalized the official adoption of the children, making sure they would never again have to worry about their safety or stability. Grace continued to excel in school, with Alexander encouraging her to chase her dream of becoming an artist. Ethan grew into a happy, energetic boy who filled the house with laughter. On Grace's birthday, Alexander threw a small party with her new friends from school. During the celebration, she handed him a gift. It was a drawing of herself, Ethan, and Alexander, with the word family written in large letters across the top. Alexander felt tears well up in his eyes. "You gave us everything," Grace said with a smile. "No," he replied, his voice filled with emotion. "You gave me everything." The mansion, once a symbol of mystery and pain, was now simply part of a bigger story. A story of how Alexander found a new purpose and how Grace and Ethan found a home. In the end, Alexander realized true wealth wasn't in material possessions but in the bonds we create and the lives we touch. The once quiet mansion transformed into a place filled with love, laughter, and hope, a home where everyone could finally begin anew.